September 14th, 1922. The sun sets over New Brunswick, New Jersey, casting long shadows across Phillips Road as two figures meet in secret for what will be their final rendezvous. Reverend Edward Hall, a respected Episcopal minister, walks hand in hand with Eleanor Mills, the church choir director whose voice once filled the sanctuary with hymns of devotion. Tonight, their devotion belongs only to each other. The year is 1922, and America is dancing to jazz music while wrestling with Prohibition's moral contradictions. In this era of shifting values and hidden vices, even men of the cloth are not immune to temptation. What begins as whispered conversations after choir practice has blossomed into a passionate affair that threatens to destroy two families and rock the foundations of New Jersey society. Edward Hall is 41 years old, silver-haired and distinguished, married to Frances Stevens Hall, a woman 7 years his senior whose family fortune built half of New Brunswick. Eleanor Mills, 34 and married to the church's caretaker, possesses a beauty that transcends her modest circumstances. Their love story reads like forbidden literature, filled with stolen moments and secret letters that speak of desires burning brighter than any altar flame. On this September evening, neither lover knows they are walking toward their death. The crisp autumn air carries no warning of the violence that awaits them in the shadows of de Russey's Lane, a lover's lane where couples from across central New Jersey seek privacy among the crab apple trees. Eleanor has told her husband James she's going for a walk. Edward has informed his household he's making pastoral calls. These small deceptions, repeated countless times over their 2-year affair, have become second nature. Tonight, however, someone is watching. Someone who knows about their Thursday evening meetings. Someone whose patience has finally reached its breaking point. The lovers meet near the abandoned Phillips farm, their familiar ritual unchanged despite the danger that has begun to close around them. Edward carries with him the burden of a man torn between sacred vows and earthly passion. Eleanor brings letters, passionate correspondence that speaks of a love so intense it defies the moral constraints of their time. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to The Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. As darkness falls over the lonely stretch of road, the couple finds their usual secluded spot beneath the sprawling branches of a crab apple tree. They spread a blanket on the ground, their conversation mixing whispered endearments with practical concerns about their impossible situation. Edward speaks of leaving his wife, of starting fresh somewhere far from New Brunswick's watchful eyes. Eleanor dreams aloud of a life where their love need not hide in shadows. But someone else has different plans for their future. The killer approaches through the darkness, moving with purpose and deadly intent. What happens next will transform this quiet New Jersey township into the center of a media firestorm that will rage for years. The shots that ring out on this September night will echo through courtrooms, newspaper headlines, and the American consciousness for decades to come. By dawn, 2 lives will be extinguished, 2 families will be shattered, and one of the most perplexing murder mysteries in American history will begin. The Hall Mills murders will expose the dark underbelly of small-town respectability, where passion, jealousy, and social standing collide with fatal consequences. The lovers' last meeting ends not with a kiss, but with gunfire that shatters the autumn silence forever. The morning sun of September 16th, 1922, rises over what should have been another peaceful Saturday in Somerset County. Instead, it illuminates a crime scene so shocking that it will sear itself into the collective memory of a nation still reeling from the Great War's aftermath. At approximately 9:30 a.m., Pearl Bomber and Raymond Schneider, a young couple seeking their own romantic privacy, stumble upon a sight that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Beneath the sprawling branches of a crab apple tree on de Russey's Lane, 2 bodies lie arranged in a grotesque tableau of death. The Reverend Edward Hall lies on his back, arms positioned carefully at his sides, his clerical collar still pristine despite the violence that has befallen him. A single bullet has entered his head just above the right ear, the execution-style wound suggesting cold calculation rather than passionate fury. His gold watch remains untouched. His wallet still contains money. This is no robbery gone wrong. Beside him, Eleanor Mills presents a far more disturbing sight. Her body has been positioned with deliberate care, her dress pulled down modestly to cover her legs, her hands folded across her chest in an almost ceremonial arrangement. But her face tells a different story entirely. Her throat has been slashed with such savage force that she is nearly decapitated, the wound gaping like a grotesque second mouth that speaks silently of unimaginable rage. The killer has left a calling card of sorts. Scattered around the bodies are torn fragments of love letters, passionate correspondence between the victims that flutters in the morning breeze like macabre confetti. Some pieces are readable, revealing phrases that burn with romantic intensity. I know there are girls with more shapely bodies, but I do not care what they have. I have the greatest of all blessings, the deep, true, and eternal love of a noble man. Young Raymond Schneider races to the nearest house to telephone the authorities, his voice shaking as he reports the discovery. Within the hour, de Russey's Lane swarms with police officers, newspaper reporters, and curious onlookers drawn by the magnetic pull of violent death. The crime scene, however, has already been fatally compromised. Detective George Totten of the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office arrives to find chaos rather than careful investigation. Souvenir hunters have already pilfered pieces of the torn love letters. Spectators trample potential evidence into the soft earth. The bodies themselves have been moved and repositioned multiple times before proper photographs can be taken. What emerges from this investigative disaster is a crime that defies simple explanation. The careful arrangement of the bodies suggests someone with intimate knowledge of both victims. The savage nature of Eleanor's wounds speaks to personal hatred and jealous rage. Yet the precision of Edward's execution hints at cold-blooded calculation. Dr. William Long, the Somerset County physician who examines the bodies, determines that both victims have been dead for approximately 36 hours, placing the time of death around 10 p.m. on September 14th. The autopsies reveal additional disturbing details. Eleanor Mills has been shot 3 times in the face after her throat was cut, as if the killer's fury required multiple expressions of violence. The torn love letters, painstakingly reassembled by investigators, reveal the depth of passion that drove this affair. Eleanor's words to Edward speak of desperate longing. "Oh, honey, I am fiery today. Burning, flaming love." Edward's responses match her intensity. "My darling Wonder Heart, I just want to crush you for 2 hours." As news of the double murder spreads beyond Somerset County, it becomes clear that this is no ordinary crime of passion. The victims' prominent social positions, the scandalous nature of their affair, and the brutal savagery of their deaths combine to create a perfect storm of public fascination. Newspaper editors across the country recognize immediately that they have stumbled upon a story that will sell papers for months to come. The Hall Mills murders possess every element of a sensational drama: forbidden love, religious hypocrisy, violent death, and wealthy suspects whose reputations hang in the balance. By evening, de Russey's Lane has been transformed into a grotesque tourist attraction. Hundreds of curiosity seekers arrive by automobile and trolley to gawk at the crime scene, picking through the remaining debris for souvenirs and speculating wildly about the identity of the killer. The investigation that should have begun with careful preservation of evidence instead starts with contamination and chaos. This fundamental failure will plague the case for years to come, allowing a clever killer to escape justice and leaving behind only questions that multiply like autumn leaves in the wind. The lovers who sought privacy in life have found only infamy in death, their secret passion transformed into front-page headlines that will make the Hall Mills murders synonymous with the dark side of the Roaring Twenties. Edward Wheeler Hall possessed the kind of commanding presence that filled pulpits and commanded respect throughout New Brunswick's most prestigious neighborhoods. Standing 6 feet tall with distinguished silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, he embodied everything the Episcopal congregation of St. John the Evangelist sought in their spiritual leader. Yet beneath his clerical robes beat the heart of a man torn between sacred duty and earthly desire. Born in Brooklyn in 1881 to a family of modest means, Edward demonstrated early intellectual brilliance that earned him a scholarship to study theology. His ordination in 1909 marked the beginning of what appeared to be a promising ecclesiastical career. When he accepted the position at St. John the Evangelist in 1909, He seemed destined for a life of quiet ministerial success in one of New Jersey's most affluent parishes. The congregation that welcomed Reverend Hall represented the cream of New Brunswick society, successful businessmen, prominent attorneys, and families whose names adorned the town's most important institutions. Among these parishioners were the Stevens family, whose wealth derived from extensive real estate holdings and whose daughter Frances would soon capture the young minister's attention. Frances Stevens Hall was 37 when she married 28-year-old Edward in 1911. 7 years his senior, she brought to the union not only her family's considerable fortune, but also the social connections that could elevate a humble minister into the upper echelons of New Jersey society. The Stevens mansion on Nickel Avenue became Edward's new home, a grand Victorian structure that spoke of old money and established power. For 11 years, Edward Hall appeared to embody ministerial virtue. His sermons drew packed congregations who hung on his every word about moral rectitude and Christian devotion. His pastoral visits to the sick and bereaved earned him a reputation for compassion and spiritual wisdom. The community saw him as a pillar of moral authority, a man whose life exemplified the Christian values he preached from the pulpit. But human nature, as Edward himself might have observed, is infinitely complex. The transformation began subtly in 1920 when Eleanor Mills joined the church choir. Her voice possessed a haunting quality that seemed to reach into the very soul of those who heard her sing. During rehearsals, as Eleanor's soprano soared through the sanctuary's vaulted space, Edward found himself drawn not merely to her musical talent, but to the woman herself. Eleanor Reinhardt Mills had married James Mills, the church sexton, in 1911, the same year Edward wed Frances. At 34, she retained the beauty that had attracted admirers since her teenage years, but life with James, a man 16 years her senior, had settled into a routine of modest comfort and predictable days. Her marriage produced 2 children, Charlotte and Daniel, but not the passionate love that Eleanor's romantic nature craved. What began as conversations about him selections gradually evolved into something far more dangerous. Edward discovered in Eleanor a woman who appreciated literature and poetry, who could discuss philosophy and theology with genuine understanding. She found in him not merely a minister but a man of deep sensitivity who treated her as an intellectual equal rather than merely a church member's wife. Their first stolen kiss came during a late evening choir rehearsal in the spring of 1921. The sanctuary, empty except for the two of them, witnessed the moment when spiritual devotion transformed into earthly passion. From that night forward, their Thursday evening meetings became a sacred ritual of their own creation. The letters they exchanged reveal the depth of their emotional and physical connection. Edward wrote with the eloquence of a trained theologian, but his words burned with desires that would have scandalized his congregation. My own dear Gyp, your letter made me happy and unhappy too, for while it breathed the love and devotion which I crave, it also told me of your troubles. Eleanor's responses matched his intensity, revealing a woman transformed by love from dutiful wife into passionate lover. My darling, my wonder boy, I am thinking of you every minute of the day. How I love you, how I want you. Their affair required elaborate deceptions that became increasingly difficult to maintain. Edward invented pastoral duties that would take him away from home on Thursday evenings. Eleanor claimed she needed solitary walks for her health. Both became accomplished liars, their Sunday morning appearances in church a performance of respectability that masked the truth of their Thursday night encounters. The psychological toll on Edward became evident to those who knew him well. His sermons began to focus obsessively on themes of temptation and redemption. He lost weight and developed the haunted look of a man wrestling with impossible choices. Several parishioners later recalled sensing a change in their minister during the months before his death, a distance and distraction that seemed inconsistent with his usual pastoral manner. By September 1922, the affair had reached a crisis point. Eleanor pressed Edward to leave his wife and marry her, willing to face social ostracism for the chance at genuine happiness. Edward found himself torn between the woman he loved and the life he had built, between passion and duty, between his heart and his position in society. The double life that Edward Hall had maintained for nearly 2 years was becoming unsustainable. The pressure was building toward an explosion that would destroy not only his carefully constructed reputation, but ultimately cost him his life. On September 14, 1922, when Edward made his final decision to meet Eleanor at de Russey's Lane, he was walking toward either liberation or destruction. The Reverend who had preached about moral choices for over a decade was about to discover that some decisions exact the ultimate price. The love letters scattered around Eleanor Mills' mutilated body told a story more passionate and desperate than any romance novel of the Jazz Age. Torn into fragments by the killer's rage, these intimate confessions would become the prosecution's most damning evidence and the defense's greatest challenge. Each reconstructed page revealed not just an affair, but an obsession that consumed two souls completely. Eleanor Mills possessed a gift for expressing her deepest emotions with startling honesty. Her letters to Edward Hall read like diary entries from a woman discovering love for the first time at age 34. "I have been thinking all day about something you said," she wrote in one letter that investigators painstakingly pieced together from bloodstained fragments. "That you were lonesome and wanted your Gyp to come to you. Oh, if I only could have gone." The nickname Gyp revealed the private language of their relationship, a pet name that spoke of intimacy beyond the formal Reverend Hall. She called him in public. Eleanor's letters showed a woman transformed by love from dutiful housewife into passionate lover willing to risk everything for stolen moments with her beloved minister. "How can I begin to tell you what these 2 years have meant to me?" Eleanor wrote in what would prove to be one of her final letters to Edward. "They have been the most wonderful 2 years of my life. Before you came into my life, I never knew what it was to be really happy. Now I know, and I can never go back to the old life." Her correspondence revealed the practical challenges of conducting a clandestine affair in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Eleanor described elaborate schemes to create opportunities for private meetings, including feigning illness to miss church events where Edward's absence might be noticed. She wrote of the agony of sitting in the congregation on Sunday mornings, maintaining a facade of propriety while her heart raced at the sight of him in the pulpit. The physical passion described in these letters shocked investigators and would later scandalize newspaper readers across America. Eleanor's frank discussions of their intimate encounters challenged the era's assumptions about feminine modesty and religious propriety. "I want you so much," she wrote in one particularly explicit passage. "Every fiber of my being cries out for you." Edward's letters to Eleanor, equally passionate but written with the educated eloquence of his theological training, revealed a man struggling with the contradiction between his spiritual calling and earthly desires. "My darling wonder heart," he addressed her in letter after letter. "You have brought sunshine into my life when all was darkness." His correspondence showed a sophisticated understanding of their impossible situation. "I know what people would say if they knew about us," he wrote. "They would call us sinners, hypocrites. But I cannot believe that love like ours could be wrong in God's eyes. Surely he understands the human heart better than the narrow minds who would judge us." The letters revealed Edward's growing desperation to find a solution that would allow them to be together openly. He researched divorce laws in multiple states, seeking jurisdictions where he might dissolve his marriage to Frances without destroying his career entirely. His letters to Eleanor included detailed discussions of cities where they might start fresh, far from New Brunswick's suffocating social expectations. "I have been making inquiries," he wrote just weeks before his death, "about positions in the western states where a man's past might matter less than his present devotion to duty. Would you be willing to face the hardships of frontier life if it meant we could be together as man and wife?" Eleanor's response was immediate and unequivocal. "I would follow you to the ends of the earth. Riches mean nothing to me compared to the wealth of your love. I would rather live in a cabin with you than in a palace without you." The correspondence also revealed Eleanor's growing impatience with their clandestine relationship. Her letters from the summer of 1922 showed increasing frustration with the secrecy and deception their affair required. "I am tired of hiding," she wrote. "Tired of pretending not to love you when my heart wants to shout it from the rooftops. How much longer must we wait?" More ominously, some of Eleanor's final letters hinted that their secret might not be as secure as they believed. "I had the strangest feeling yesterday that someone was watching me," she wrote in early September. "When I turned around, no one was there. but I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. Another letter, dated just days before the murders, contained an even more chilling observation. James has been asking odd questions about where I go on my evening walks. I told him I simply enjoy the fresh air, but he seemed skeptical. We must be more careful, my darling. The killer's decision to scatter these intimate letters around Eleanor's body spoke to more than mere rage. It represented a deliberate attempt to humiliate the lovers, even in death. The act of tearing the correspondence into fragments suggested someone who had read these passionate exchanges and felt personally betrayed by their contents. When investigators finished reconstructing the letters, they possessed not just evidence of an affair, but a complete psychological portrait of two people whose love had become both their greatest joy and ultimate doom. The correspondence revealed Eleanor Mills as a woman of surprising depth and passion, far more complex than the simple church choir director the public had imagined. These letters would soon become exhibits in a courtroom drama that would captivate the nation. But first, investigators had to determine who else might have read these intimate confessions, who had access to the lovers' secret correspondence, and who possessed both the motive and opportunity to turn passionate words into evidence at a crime scene. The burning love revealed in Eleanor's letters had indeed consumed everything in its path, leaving only ashes and blood-stained fragments scattered beneath a crab-apple tree on a lonely New Jersey road. Frances Stevens Hall presented to the world the image of a grieving widow, but beneath her composed exterior lay a woman whose marriage had become a carefully maintained performance long before her husband's brutal murder. At 48, she possessed the kind of steely dignity that wealth and breeding could provide, yet investigators would soon discover that Mrs. Hall's actions on the night of September 14th raised more questions than her tears could answer. The Stevens family had ruled New Brunswick society for generations, their influence extending from the boardrooms of local banks to the committees that shaped the town's cultural life. Frances had grown up understanding that reputation was currency more valuable than the considerable fortune her family had amassed through shrewd real estate investments. When she married the handsome young minister 11 years her junior, she believed she had secured both a suitable husband and a valuable addition to the Stevens social legacy. But by 1922, the marriage had settled into the kind of polite indifference that characterized many unions among the upper classes. Edward fulfilled his duties as a husband in public, escorting Frances to social events and maintaining the appearance of domestic harmony. Privately, however, their relationship had grown cold, marked by separate bedrooms and increasingly stilted conversations. Frances was not naive about her husband's wandering eye. Several servants later testified that they had observed tensions between the couple, whispered arguments behind closed doors, and Mrs. Hall's growing suspicion about Edward's Thursday evening absences. Yet she maintained her dignity with the kind of rigid self-control that her social position demanded, never allowing public acknowledgement of her private humiliation. On the evening of September 14th, Frances Stevens Hall's whereabouts became the subject of intense scrutiny. According to her initial statement to police, she had spent a quiet evening at home, reading in the library while her husband made his pastoral calls. She claimed to have gone to bed around 10 o'clock without knowing exactly when Edward returned home. However, this simple narrative began to unravel under closer examination. Louise Geist, the family's maid, provided a different account of that evening's events. According to Geist, Mrs. Hall had seemed unusually agitated during dinner, barely touching her food and repeatedly checking the clock. Around 9:30, the maid claimed Frances had dismissed the household staff early and insisted she preferred to be alone for the remainder of the evening. More troubling was the testimony of Barbara Tuff, the Hall's cook, who insisted she had seen Mrs. Hall leaving the house through the kitchen door sometime after 10 o'clock. When confronted with this contradiction, Frances maintained that the cook was mistaken, suggesting that the woman might have glimpsed her moving through the darkened house and confused shadow with substance. The investigation revealed that Frances possessed detailed knowledge of her husband's affair with Eleanor Mills. Hidden in her bedroom dresser, detectives discovered copies of several love letters between the couple, suggesting that Mrs. Hall had been intercepting and reading their correspondence for months. The discovery shattered her claims of ignorance about Edward's infidelity and established a clear motive for murder. Even more damaging was the revelation that Frances had hired a private detective in August 1922 to follow her husband and document his Thursday evening activities. The detective, Raymond Schindler, had provided Mrs. Hall with detailed reports of Edward and Eleanor's meetings at de Russey's Lane, complete with photographs of the couple embracing beneath the crabapple tree where their bodies would later be found. Frances's reaction to this evidence revealed the first cracks in her composed facade. When shown the photographs during police questioning, she initially claimed never to have seen them before. Only when confronted with the detective's testimony did she admit to hiring surveillance, explaining her actions as those of a wife seeking to understand her husband's changed behavior. "I needed to know the truth," she told investigators, her voice maintaining its aristocratic composure even as tears finally appeared in her eyes. "A wife has the right to know where her husband spends his evenings, doesn't she?" The financial implications of Edward's affair added another layer to Frances's potential motive. Under New Jersey law, a husband's adultery could affect property settlements in divorce proceedings. More importantly, for someone of Frances's social standing, a public divorce would have destroyed the carefully cultivated reputation that meant everything to the Stevens family. Friends and family members painted a picture of a woman under enormous pressure in the weeks leading up to the murders. Eleanor's sister testified that Frances had approached her at a church social in early September, making veiled comments about women who don't know their place and the price of destroying respectable families. Margaret Dickman, a family friend, recalled a disturbing conversation with Frances just days before the murders. "She seemed almost relieved about something," Dickman told investigators. "She said she had been carrying a heavy burden, but that soon her troubles would be over. I thought she was referring to Edward's recent health problems, but now I wonder if she meant something else entirely." The physical evidence against Frances remained largely circumstantial, but investigators discovered several troubling details. A .32 caliber revolver registered to the Stevens family was missing from the house, though Frances claimed it had been stolen weeks earlier. Additionally, examination of her clothes revealed microscopic traces of what appeared to be gunpowder residue, though this evidence would later be challenged by defense experts. Perhaps most damning was Frances's behavior in the days immediately following the discovery of the bodies. While publicly playing the role of grieving widow, she had quietly contacted attorneys about protecting the Stevens family assets and reputation. She also made arrangements to have all of Edward's personal papers removed from the church rectory before investigators could examine them thoroughly. When pressed about these seemingly cold-blooded actions, Frances maintained that she was simply being practical. "Edward was dead," she said with characteristic bluntness. "Nothing I could do would bring him back, but I still had responsibilities to my family and our good name." The portrait that emerged was of a woman caught between genuine grief and calculated self-preservation, someone whose privileged upbringing had taught her that appearances mattered more than emotions. Whether Frances Stevens Hall was a wronged wife driven to murder by jealousy and humiliation, or simply a woman struggling to maintain dignity in the face of public scandal, would become one of the central questions in America's most sensational murder trial. In the pantheon of American criminal history, few witnesses have captured public imagination quite like Jane Gibson, a 50-year-old pig farmer whose midnight encounter on Phillips Road would transform her from an obscure rural eccentric into the most controversial witness in the trial of the century. Known to neighbors as the Pig Woman for her habit of tending swine in the darkness, Gibson possessed a story so bizarre and detailed that it would either crack the case wide open or demonstrate how easily fantasy could masquerade as truth. Jane Gibson lived alone in a ramshackle farmhouse adjacent to the Phillips property, her only companions a collection of pigs, chickens, and an ancient mule named Jenny. At 50, she had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades battling both the elements and poverty, her sharp eyes reflecting a shrewdness born of hard experience. Neighbors considered her something of a local character, a woman whose nocturnal wanderings and confrontational personality had earned her a reputation as both fearless and slightly unhinged. On the night of September 14, 1922, Gibson's insomnia would place her at the center of one of America's most enduring mysteries. According to her initial statement to police, she had been unable to sleep due to concerns about corn thieves who had been raiding her modest crop. Around 9 o'clock, She had saddled Jenny and ridden out to patrol her property, a routine that had become second nature during the autumn harvest season. What happened next, according to Gibson's increasingly elaborate testimony, was a sequence of events that read like a scene from a pulp detective novel. As she approached the area near to Russie's Lane, she claimed to have heard voices engaged in heated argument. Dismounting from Jenny, she had crept closer through the underbrush, drawn by curiosity about the unusual late-night activity. Gibson's description of the scene that unfolded was both vivid and disturbing. She claimed to have witnessed 4 figures gathered beneath the crabapple tree. 2 she identified as Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills, and 2 others whose faces remained hidden in shadow. The conversation, she insisted, had quickly escalated into shouting, with one of the mysterious figures accusing the lovers of destroying everything decent and holy. "I heard that woman's voice," Gibson would later testify, her weathered finger pointing dramatically across the courtroom. "High and shrill, like a bird being strangled. She was saying terrible things about the choir woman, calling her names I won't repeat in polite company." According to Gibson's account, the argument had lasted nearly 20 minutes before suddenly exploding into violence. She claimed to have witnessed the flash of gunfire, heard Eleanor Mills scream, and seen one of the shadowy figures bend over the fallen woman with what appeared to be a knife. Terrified, Gibson said she had fled the scene on Jenny, racing back to her farmhouse where she had cowered in terror until dawn. The story might have ended there, dismissed as the ravings of an attention-seeking eccentric, except for one crucial detail. Jane Gibson had waited 4 days before approaching the police with her account. When questioned about this delay, she claimed to have been paralyzed by fear, convinced that the killers would murder her if they discovered she had witnessed their crime. "I knew they'd come for me," she told investigators, her voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine terror. "Rich people like that, they got ways of making problems disappear. I seen what they'd done to those 2 under the tree. I wasn't about to end up the same way." Detective George Totten found Gibson's story both compelling and problematic. On one hand, her description of the crime scene contained details that had not been released to the public, including the specific arrangement of the bodies and the scattered love letters. On the other hand, her 4-day delay in coming forward, combined with her reputation for dramatic storytelling, raised serious questions about her credibility. More troubling was the evolution of Gibson's story under repeated questioning. Each time investigators interviewed her, new details emerged. She began describing the clothing worn by the mysterious figures, claiming she could identify jewelry and distinctive physical characteristics, despite the darkness that she had initially said obscured their faces. Gibson's most sensational claim involved her identification of one of the killers. During a police lineup conducted weeks after the murders, she dramatically pointed at Frances Stevens Hall, declaring, "That's her. That's the woman I saw standing over the choir lady with blood on her hands." The identification sent shockwaves through New Brunswick society and provided prosecutors with their most direct evidence linking Mrs. Hall to the crime. However, Gibson's credibility suffered serious damage when defense attorneys began investigating her background. They discovered a history of mental instability, including a previous commitment to a psychiatric facility for what doctors had termed hysteric episodes. More damaging was the revelation that Gibson had approached several newspaper reporters before contacting police, attempting to sell her story to the highest bidder. The defense also raised questions about Gibson's physical ability to witness the events she described. Medical examination revealed that she suffered from severe myopia that would have made detailed observation impossible at the distances she claimed. Additionally, analysis of the crime scene suggested that her alleged vantage point would have been obscured by trees and underbrush, making visual identification nearly impossible even under ideal conditions. As the investigation progressed, Jane Gibson's story became both the prosecution's strongest weapon and its greatest vulnerability. Her testimony provided the only alleged eyewitness account of the murders, but her obvious eccentricities and evolving narrative made her an unreliable foundation upon which to build a case against one of New Jersey's most prominent families. The Pig Woman had become a symbol of the case's broader themes: the collision between rural simplicity and urban sophistication, between honest testimony and calculated deception, between justice and social privilege. Whether Jane Gibson was a brave witness risking her life to expose the truth or a disturbed woman seeking attention through elaborate fantasy would become one of the trial's central questions. Her midnight ride on Jenny had transformed an obscure pig farmer into a key player in America's most sensational murder case. But it remained to be seen whether her testimony would lead to justice or simply add another layer of confusion to an already bewildering mystery. The Stevens family mansion on Nickel Avenue stood as a monument to 4 generations of accumulated wealth and social influence, its Victorian grandeur hiding secrets that would soon be dragged into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Behind the carefully maintained facade of respectability lived a collection of individuals whose eccentricities, jealousies, and fierce loyalty to family honor would make them prime suspects in one of America's most notorious murders. Frances Stevens Hall was not the only family member with a motive to eliminate the scandal threatening their carefully constructed reputation. The Stevens clan formed a tight-knit circle of privilege and protection, bound together by shared wealth and an almost pathological devotion to maintaining their social standing. Each member possessed both the means and potential motivation to silence the lovers whose affair threatened to destroy everything the family had built over nearly a century. Henry Stevens, Frances's brother, emerged as perhaps the most intriguing figure in this gallery of potential killers. At 54, he remained unmarried, living in the family mansion and devoting his life to managing the extensive Stevens real estate holdings. Neighbors described him as a brilliant but peculiar man whose devotion to his sister bordered on the obsessive. His intimate knowledge of firearms, acquired during years of hunting expeditions, made him particularly interesting to investigators. Henry's alibi for September 14th was as carefully constructed as it was suspicious. He claimed to have spent the evening at his private club, the New Brunswick Athletic Association, playing cards with several prominent businessmen. However, the timeline he provided contained troubling gaps, and at least one club member later told police he could not definitively confirm Henry's presence during the crucial hours between 9 and 11 o'clock. More damning was Henry's behavior immediately following the discovery of the bodies. While Frances played the grieving widow, Henry took charge of protecting the family's interests with ruthless efficiency. He hired private detectives to investigate the backgrounds of potential witnesses, arranged for the family's most incriminating documents to be removed from their home before police searches, and retained the services of New Jersey's most expensive criminal defense attorneys before anyone in the family had been officially charged. Henry Stevens acted like a man who knew trouble was coming, observed Detective Totten years later. Most innocent people wait to see what develops. Henry started building defenses before anyone accused him of anything. The investigation revealed that Henry possessed detailed knowledge of his brother-in-law's affair months before the murders. Servants testified that they had overheard heated arguments between Henry and Frances about Edward's behavior, with Henry reportedly declaring that something had to be done to protect the family honor. His access to Frances's intercepted love letters meant he understood the full extent of the scandal threatening to engulf the Stevens name. Willie Stevens, the youngest brother, presented an entirely different but equally fascinating profile. At 46, Willie had the mental development of a child, his intellectual disabilities making him simultaneously pitiable and potentially dangerous. He lived under his siblings' protection, rarely venturing beyond the family property except for supervised outings to the local library, where he spent hours reading adventure stories and detective novels. Willie's childlike demeanor masked a surprisingly detailed knowledge of criminal methods gleaned from his voracious consumption of crime fiction. Police discovered his room contained hundreds of mystery novels, their margins filled with Willie's careful annotations about murder techniques, alibis, and methods of disposing of evidence. His fascination with fictional crimes raised disturbing questions about whether he might have attempted to implement some of these methods in real life. On September 14th, Willie claimed to have been in his room reading, as was his nightly routine. However, the family's cook later testified that she had noticed Willie's muddy shoes in the kitchen the following morning, despite his insistence that he had not left the house. When questioned about this discrepancy, Willie became agitated and confused, his responses degenerating into the kind of childish denials that made him both sympathetic and suspicious. The Stevens family's unified response to the investigation revealed a level of coordination that struck many observers as rehearsed. Each family member provided alibis that perfectly complemented the others, creating an interlocking web of testimony that was either remarkably truthful or carefully orchestrated fiction. Their refusal to submit to detailed police questioning without their attorneys present further fueled suspicions about their collective guilt. Financial records subpoenaed during the investigation revealed another potential motive for murder. Edward Hall's death meant that Frances would inherit his modest estate while retaining full control of her considerably larger Stevens family fortune. A messy divorce, particularly one involving adultery, might have resulted in Edward claiming a portion of the Stevens' wealth, a possibility that would have horrified a family whose identity was inseparable from their financial status. The family's treatment of Edward during his final months also raised troubling questions. Several friends testified that they had noticed a change in the family's attitude toward the minister, a cooling of relations that suggested growing awareness of his affair. Christmas 1921 had been the last occasion when Edward was treated as a full family member. By summer 1922, he had been relegated to the status of an unwelcome house guest barely tolerated for appearance's sake. Most revealing was the discovery of a family meeting held just weeks before the murders, during which the Stevens clan had gathered to discuss the Edward problem. While no minutes were kept of this conference, servants reported hearing raised voices and heated discussions about family honor, public reputation, and the need for decisive action to address the crisis. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The Stevens family had spent generations building their reputation and social position, accumulating not just wealth but the kind of influence that could shape public opinion and legal outcomes. When faced with a scandal that threatened everything they valued, they had responded with the kind of ruthless efficiency that suggested long experience in protecting their interests. Whether they had protected those interests through murder remained the central question as the investigation moved toward its dramatic climax. The family that had lived by the rules of social privilege was about to discover whether those same rules could shield them from the consequences of their darkest secrets. November 3rd, 1926, dawned crisp and clear over Somerville, New Jersey, as the sleepy county seat prepared to host what newspapers had already christened the trial of the century. For years after the murders at DeRussey's Lane, the case that had captivated America finally reached its legal climax. The Somerset County Courthouse, a modest brick building designed for routine legal proceedings, found itself transformed into the epicenter of a media circus that would reshape how America consumed crime news. By 6 o'clock that morning, more than 2,000 spectators had gathered outside the courthouse, their breath visible in the autumn air as they jostled for position in lines that stretched for blocks. Newspaper reporters from across the country had descended on Somerville like locusts, their press credentials granting access to a story that had already generated more column inches than the presidential election. Radio stations prepared for the first live courtroom broadcasts in New Jersey history, bringing the drama directly into American living rooms. Frances Stevens Hall arrived at the courthouse in a black Cadillac, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to the circus atmosphere surrounding her. At 52, she had aged visibly during the 4 years since her husband's murder, her once auburn hair now gray, her aristocratic features marked by the strain of living under constant suspicion. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the dignity that wealth and breeding could provide, even when facing charges that could send her to the electric chair. Flanked by her brothers Henry and Willie, Frances made her way through the crowd with the kind of regal bearing that seemed to emphasize the gulf between her social position and that of the common people who had come to witness her potential downfall. Henry Stevens, now 58, maintained his role as the family's protector, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd for threats while his hand remained protectively on his sister's arm. Willie, still childlike at 50 despite his years, seemed bewildered by the attention, his presence adding a note of pathos to the family's public ordeal. The prosecution team, led by State Senator Alexander Simpson, represented New Jersey's determination to prove that wealth and social position could not purchase immunity from justice. Simpson, a skilled orator with political ambitions, understood that this case could make or break his career. His strategy centered on painting the Stevens family as cold-blooded killers who had murdered 2 innocent people to protect their reputation and fortune. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Simpson declared in his opening statement, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. We will prove that jealousy, greed, and a perverted sense of family honor drove these defendants to commit murder most foul. No amount of wealth, no degree of social standing, can excuse the brutal slaying of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. The defense team, led by Robert McCarter, a former New Jersey Attorney General whose fees alone exceeded the annual budgets of most small towns, presented an entirely different narrative. McCarter's strategy involved portraying his clients as victims of a prejudiced investigation that had targeted them simply because of their wealth and prominence. His opening statement painted a picture of a grieving widow and her devoted family being persecuted by ambitious prosecutors seeking publicity. The state's case, McCarter argued with theatrical flair, rests upon the fevered imaginings of witnesses whose motives are as questionable as their testimony. My clients stand before you not as criminals, but as citizens whose only crime was being wealthy enough to make convenient scapegoats for an unsolved murder. The early days of testimony focused on establishing the timeline and circumstances of the murders. Dr. William Long's forensic evidence painted a gruesome picture of the violence that had befallen the lovers, while Detective George Totten walked the jury through the contaminated crime scene that had hampered the investigation from its earliest hours. But it was Jane Gibson's testimony that transformed the courtroom into a theater of the absurd. The pig woman, now 54 and visibly ill, was wheeled into court on a hospital bed, her dramatic entrance setting the tone for testimony that would be both compelling and preposterous. Propped up on pillows and speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, Gibson repeated her story of witnessing the murders while dramatically pointing her finger at Frances Hall. "That's the woman," Gibson declared, her voice suddenly finding strength as she identified the defendant. "I seen her standing over that poor choir lady with blood on her hands and murder in her heart." McCarter's cross-examination of Gibson became the trial's most memorable moment, a masterclass in destroying witness credibility that legal scholars would study for decades. With surgical precision, he dissected Gibson's story, revealing the inconsistencies, impossibilities, and outright fabrications that riddled her testimony. "Mrs. Gibson," McCarter asked with deadly quiet, "you testified that you could clearly see my client's face in the darkness at a distance of over 100 yards. Yet medical records show you suffer from severe myopia that makes it impossible for you to see clearly beyond 20 feet, even in daylight. How do you explain this contradiction?" Gibson's responses grew increasingly defensive and contradictory under McCarter's relentless questioning. When confronted with evidence of her previous attempts to sell her story to newspapers, she became belligerent, accusing the defense attorney of trying to twist the truth to protect his wealthy clients. The prosecution's case suffered further damage when several key witnesses either recanted their previous statements or provided testimony that directly contradicted the state's theory. Louise Geist, the Hall's former maid, admitted under cross-examination that she had been pressured by police to embellish her testimony about Frances Hall's behavior on the night of the murders. "They kept asking me the same questions over and over," Geist testified, tears streaming down her face. "They said if I didn't remember more details, the Real killers might go free. I just wanted to help, but I think I said things that weren't exactly true." The defense presented its case with the kind of meticulous preparation that unlimited resources could provide. Expert witnesses challenged every aspect of the state's forensic evidence, while character witnesses testified to the defendants' exemplary reputations and peaceful natures. McCarter painted a picture of a family that, while perhaps cold and calculating in business, lacked the capacity for the kind of brutal violence that had occurred at DeRussey's Lane. Willie Stevens proved to be the defense's most effective witness, his childlike demeanor and obvious mental limitations making him a sympathetic figure who seemed incapable of the sophisticated planning the murders required. His testimony, delivered in simple, straightforward language, provided alibis for both himself and his siblings while revealing a touching devotion to his family. "I would never hurt anybody," Willie testified, his voice breaking with emotion. "Frances takes care of me, and I take care of her. We don't hurt people. We just want to be left alone." As the trial entered its final phase, the courtroom had become a stage for competing narratives about American society itself. The prosecution represented those who believe that justice should be blind to wealth and social position, while the defense embodied the conviction that prejudice against the wealthy could be as dangerous as any other form of discrimination. The outcome would determine not just the fate of the defendants, but the answer to fundamental questions about equality under law in Jazz-Age America. The jury that would decide the fate of Frances Stevens Hall and her brothers filed into their deliberation room on December 3, 1926, carrying with them the weight of one of the most complex and contradictory cases in American legal history. 12 men. Women were still excluded from jury service in New Jersey, represented a cross-section of middle-class society, their backgrounds ranging from shopkeepers to clerks to farmers. None possessed the wealth or social standing of the defendants, yet all understood that their verdict would be scrutinized by a nation watching to see whether American justice truly applied equally to rich and poor. The evidence they had heard over 5 weeks of testimony presented a maddening puzzle of contradictions and possibilities. The prosecution had painted a compelling picture of motive, jealous rage, family honor, and financial protection, but had failed to provide the kind of concrete physical evidence that could definitively place the defendants at the crime scene. The defense had systematically destroyed the credibility of key witnesses while presenting alternative theories that cast doubt on the entire case against the Stevens family. Judge Frank Cleary's instructions to the jury emphasized the fundamental principle that would determine the verdict: reasonable doubt. The defendants are presumed innocent, he reminded the 12 men, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. The burden rests entirely upon the state to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If you find that reasonable doubt exists, you must acquit, regardless of any suspicions you might harbor about the defendant's involvement. The concept of reasonable doubt had never been more crucial in an American courtroom. The Stevens family's wealth had purchased them the finest legal representation money could buy, creating a defense strategy that systematically exploited every weakness in the prosecution's case. Robert McCarter had demonstrated that expensive attorneys could indeed make a difference, not through corruption or influence, but through superior preparation and relentless attention to detail. The jury's first vote revealed the case's complexity. 7 voted for acquittal, 3 for conviction, and 2 remained undecided. The split reflected the fundamental problem that had plagued the investigation from its beginning: compelling circumstantial evidence undermined by questionable witnesses and contaminated physical proof. Foreman Charles Stockton, a hardware store owner from Somerville, led the discussions with methodical precision. "Let's examine what we know for certain," he told his fellow jurors as they settled in for what everyone understood would be lengthy deliberations. The victims were murdered, probably around 10 o'clock on September 14th. The love letters prove they were having an affair. Beyond that, everything becomes speculation and contradiction. The jurors spent their first day reviewing Jane Gibson's testimony, the prosecution's most dramatic evidence, but also its most problematic. Her identification of Frances Hall had provided the only alleged eyewitness account of the murders, but McCarter's cross-examination had revealed so many inconsistencies and impossibilities that several jurors openly questioned whether she had witnessed anything at all. "That woman changes her story every time someone asks her a question," observed juror William Henderson, a dairy farmer whose common-sense approach to evidence had made him influential during deliberations. "First, she can't see faces in the dark. Then she can identify jewelry and clothing. First, she's terrified to come forward. Then she's trying to sell her story to newspapers. How can we convict anyone based on testimony like that?" The financial evidence presented similar problems. While the prosecution had established that the Stevens family possessed strong motives for silencing the lovers, they had failed to prove that any family member had acted on those motives. The defendants' alibis, while convenient and mutually supporting, were not impossible or demonstrably false. Henry Stevens's movements on September 14th remained the most suspicious element of the case. His gaps in testimony and immediate post-murder actions suggested guilty knowledge, but suggestion was not proof beyond reasonable doubt. Several jurors noted that a man of his intelligence and resources could have constructed a more convincing alibi if he had been planning murder. Willie Stevens presented the defense's strongest argument for reasonable doubt. His mental limitations made him an unlikely mastermind of sophisticated murder, while his childlike devotion to his sister created sympathy that extended to the entire family. The prosecution's theory that he might have been used as a tool by his more capable siblings struck many jurors as both cruel and implausible. "Look at that poor man," argued juror Robert Mills during the second day of deliberations. "Does he look like someone capable of cutting a woman's throat?" The whole idea is monstrous. If we're going to convict people based on wild theories instead of solid evidence, then none of us are safe. The contaminated crime scene continued to haunt the prosecution's case even in the jury room. The wholesale destruction of physical evidence during the first hours after the bodies were discovered had eliminated any possibility of the kind of forensic proof that might have resolved the case definitively. Fingerprints, footprints, and other trace evidence had been trampled beyond recognition by curious onlookers and careless investigators. By the third day, the undecided jurors had joined the acquittal faction, leaving only 3 holdouts convinced of the defendant's guilt. These men, led by James Patterson, a bank clerk from New Brunswick, argued passionately that the totality of circumstantial evidence pointed inevitably toward the Stevens family's involvement. They had motive, means, and opportunity, Patterson argued. The love letters prove Francis knew about the affair. Henry had the weapons expertise to commit the murders. The family's coordinated response shows they were prepared for exactly what happened. If we can't convict on evidence like this, then wealthy people really are above the law. But even Patterson's certainty began to waver as the deliberations continued. The defense had planted too many seeds of doubt, raised too many alternative possibilities, and highlighted too many investigative failures for absolute certainty to survive. The case that had seemed so compelling in newspaper headlines became far more ambiguous under the harsh light of legal scrutiny. The breakthrough came on the 4th day when the jury requested to review Judge Cleary's instructions about reasonable doubt. The judge's careful explanation of the concept, doubt based on reason rather than mere possibility, helped clarify the standard they must apply. The question was not whether the Stevens family might have committed the murders, but whether the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that they had done so. After 5 days of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous, not guilty on all counts. The jury had concluded that while the defendants might have been involved in the murders, the state had failed to meet its burden of proof. Reasonable doubt, that cornerstone of American justice, had prevailed over suspicion and circumstantial evidence. The acquittal sent shockwaves through the courtroom and across the nation. Supporters of the defendants celebrated a victory for justice over prejudice, while critics denounced yet another example of how wealth could purchase freedom. The Stevens family had survived the legal challenge, but their victory came at an enormous cost in reputation, privacy, and peace of mind. The Hall Mills murders would remain officially unsolved, a testament to both the complexity of criminal investigation and the protective power of reasonable doubt in American jurisprudence. The verdict that freed the Stevens family echoed through American society like a gunshot in an empty cathedral, reverberating long after the courtroom had emptied and the defendants had disappeared behind the walls of their Nickel Avenue mansion. December 3, 1926, marked not just the end of a sensational trial, but the beginning of a mystery that would outlive everyone who witnessed those autumn days in De Russey's Lane. Frances Stevens Hall emerged from the courthouse a free woman, but hardly a vindicated one. The legal system had declared her innocent, but public opinion remained divided, creating a verdict more complex than any jury could deliver. She returned to her family mansion to discover that wealth and social position, while powerful enough to purchase the finest legal defense, could not restore a reputation shattered by 4 years of lurid headlines and salacious speculation. The Stevens family's victory proved Pyrrhic in ways that became apparent almost immediately. New Brunswick society, which had once embraced them as pillars of respectability, now treated them with the kind of polite distance reserved for those touched by scandal. Former friends crossed streets to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Social invitations ceased arriving. The family that had once ruled local society found themselves rulers of nothing but an increasingly empty kingdom. Henry Stevens, the brilliant brother who had orchestrated the family's defense, never recovered from the strain of the trial. Friends noticed a marked change in his demeanor, the sharp wit replaced by periods of brooding silence. the confident bearing undermined by a nervous habit of constantly checking over his shoulder. He began drinking heavily, a vice that had been foreign to his disciplined nature, and his management of the family's business interests became increasingly erratic. Willie Stevens, perhaps because of his intellectual limitations, adapted better to their new circumstances than his more sophisticated siblings. His childlike nature seemed to insulate him from the social ostracism that devastated Francis and Henry. He continued his daily walks to the library, apparently oblivious to the whispers that followed him through New Brunswick streets. In many ways, Willie became the most tragic figure of the entire saga, an innocent man whose mental disabilities had made him a suspect in murders he could barely comprehend. The case's impact extended far beyond the Stevens family, transforming American journalism and legal procedure in ways that persist to this day. The Hall Mills murders marked the birth of modern crime reporting, establishing templates for coverage that would be repeated in countless future cases. The combination of sex, violence, wealth, and mystery proved irresistible to a public hungry for distraction from the mundane realities of everyday life. Newspaper circulation figures during the trial reached unprecedented levels, demonstrating the commercial potential of sensational crime coverage. The New York Daily News increased its press runs by over 200,000 copies during the trial's peak weeks. Radio stations discovered that courtroom broadcasts drew larger audiences than popular entertainment programs. The case established crime as a form of mass entertainment that would eventually evolve into today's true crime industry. The trial also highlighted fundamental flaws in criminal investigation procedures that would lead to significant reforms in forensic science and evidence preservation. The contamination of the De Russey's Lane crime scene became a cautionary tale taught in police academies across the country. The case prompted the development of standardized protocols for securing murder scenes and preserving physical evidence that remain cornerstones of modern criminal investigation. Legal scholars have studied the Hall Mills case for nearly a century, not just for its sensational elements, but for its demonstration of how wealth can influence justice outcomes. The Stevens family's ability to hire expert witnesses who challenged every aspect of the prosecution's evidence illustrated the advantages that financial resources provide in criminal proceedings. The case became a landmark in discussions about equal justice under law and the role of economic inequality in legal outcomes. Jane Gibson, the pig woman whose testimony had electrified the courtroom, never recovered from her moment of national notoriety. Her health, already fragile during the trial, continued to deteriorate in its aftermath. She died in 1930, taking with her any remaining secrets about what she might have actually witnessed on that September night. To her grave, she maintained that her testimony had been truthful, leaving historians to wonder whether she was a brave witness destroyed by skillful lawyers or a disturbed woman whose fantasies had nearly sent innocent people to the electric chair. The murders themselves remain officially unsolved, though numerous theories have been proposed over the decades. Some crime historians have suggested that the killer was never seriously considered as a suspect, perhaps a rejected suitor of Eleanor Mills or a parishioner with a personal grudge against Reverend Hall. Others have proposed that the murders were committed by professional criminals hired to eliminate the scandal threatening the Stevens family reputation. The most intriguing alternative theory suggests that the case was solved correctly, but that the legal system failed to deliver justice. This interpretation holds that the Stevens family, or at least some members, were indeed guilty, but that their wealth and social position enabled them to escape conviction through superior legal representation and witness intimidation. Modern forensic techniques might have resolved the case definitively, but the physical evidence was too contaminated and degraded to benefit from contemporary analysis. The crime scene that swarmed with curiosity seekers in 1922 destroyed any possibility of DNA analysis, fingerprint recovery, or ballistic testing that could have identified the killer with scientific certainty. The crabapple tree under which Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills died continued to stand for decades after the murders, becoming an unofficial monument to their tragic love affair. Visitors would sometimes leave flowers or love notes beneath its branches, transforming the site of violence into a shrine to forbidden passion. The tree finally succumbed to disease in the 1960s, its death marking the end of a tangible connection to one of America's most famous unsolved murders. Phillips Road itself was eventually developed into suburban housing. The lonely Lover's Lane transformed into a neighborhood where children play and families build ordinary lives. Few residents know that their quiet streets were once the setting for a crime that captivated a nation and changed American journalism forever. The echoes of that September night in 1922 continue to resonate through American culture, appearing in novels, documentaries, and true crime podcasts that introduce new generations to the mystery of the Hall Mills murders. Each retelling adds new interpretations and theories, ensuring that Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills, whose love affair lasted only 2 years, will be remembered as long as Americans remain fascinated by the intersection of passion, wealth, and violent death. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The Hall Mills murders remain a perfect crime in the most literal sense. Perfect not because they were expertly planned and executed, but because they created a mystery so complex and contaminated that the truth became impossible to determine with certainty. Nearly a century later, the case continues to challenge our assumptions about justice, wealth, and the price of forbidden love in a society where appearances matter more than truth. The lovers who sought privacy in life found only infamy in death. Their secret passion transformed into public entertainment that outlasted everyone who knew them personally. In the end, perhaps that is their true legacy, not the scandal of their affair or the brutality of their deaths, but the enduring reminder that some mysteries resist all attempts at solution, leaving only questions that echo through the generations like whispers in an empty church.